And we told you about that great conversation, and in it, former Executive Director of CDD Ghana, Professor Gyimah-Boadi, has described the composition of the Justice Emile Short Commission as too narrow. The commission established by the Vice President, or the commission inaugurated by the Vice President on Friday, to probe the shootings that occurred during the Ayawaso West Wuogon by-election, is chaired by Justice Emile Short and has Professor Henrietta Mentabonsu and Patrick Ichampong as its members, with Kofi Abochi of Gimpa Law Faculty serving as its scribe. But elsewhere boss of CDD Ghana thinks the commission's composition is too much loaded with lawyers. He gave an exclusive interview with Kojo Yankson.
Since the violence broke out in the Ayawaso West Wuogon by-election, so many opinions and views have been heard. Government has taken some action by setting up a commission to look into the events that led up to it and identify any people responsible. Today we have the honor of speaking with the former executive director of CDD, a man who knows a thing or two about democracy, Professor Gyimah-Boadi, to pick his thoughts on the action that's been taken, the events that occurred, and the best way forward. So I think I would like to start from the actual events. I haven't had the opportunity to speak to you about them. How did they strike you, everything that unfolded and the way it was reported in the media?
They were striking in their extreme ugliness. They were striking and disturbing for the fact that this is not the first time we've experienced something like this in our Fourth Republic, but that this one, it showed signs of things that are already bad, getting much worse and worse. It was alarming indeed.
And since then, of course, we've heard from all manner of people on it. The government, represented by the minister responsible for national security, Brian Achampong, claimed ownership of this group of armed men and said that they had been sent there by the national security apparatus on a mission. So many views about whether the democratic nature of such a group, whether or not our constitution even allows national security to have a force, an armed force that can be deployed, no less during elections. I don't know what your take is on that.
Well, I mean, these are some of the matters that I believe the commission that has been established to look into these things will be taken up. But I think, for me, is the macro issue of why is it that Ghanaian elections are increasingly about conflict and violence, and therefore some sort of concern about and promotion of peaceful election. Elections should principally be about fairness, transparency, credibility of outcomes, and not about peacefulness necessarily. You know, that's peacefulness is only a condition, it's not the outcome.
Yeah.
And yet, increasingly, our elections are fought and discussed as if elections are war by other means. And I think that there is that macro context that, that we should be looking at, and hopefully the commission should be looking at the overall context of Ghanaian politics, Ghanaian democracy, and why is it that increasingly elections are becoming militarized, weaponized, and we experience these kinds of developments.
I think that's a good point for us to move our conversation on to the commission. The president, well, the vice president inaugurated them with the permission of the president, obviously, and they've been given a month to do a number of things. I'll just quickly read through their terms of reference, not very long. They are A, to make a full, faithful, and impartial inquiry into the circumstances of, and establish the facts leading to the events and associated violence during the Ayawaso West Wuogon by-election on the 31st of January 2019. B, to identify any person responsible for or who has been involved in the events, associated violence and injuries. C, to inquire into any matter which the Commission considers incidental or reasonably related to the causes of the events and the associated violence and injuries. And then D, to submit within 1 month its report to the President, giving reasons for its findings and recommendations, including appropriate sanctions, if any. 4 people have been appointed to do the work, the 3 members and their secretary. Perhaps we'll start there. What's your take on government's response to this incident?
Well, first of all, I applaud the government for taking this step, and that is for setting up a commission of inquiry to unravel the factors responsible for those sordid occurrences. I also applaud the government for the quality of the membership of the commission. I think that most people, most Ghanaians, most reasonable Ghanaians, most objective Ghanaians would attest today and would agree that these are some of the best, most credible, professionally accomplished individuals we have in our land, statesmen and women. I do have a little bit of a concern. Well, not a little bit. I think the composition is a bit too narrow, confined, as it were, to lawyers. It's not that it's a bad idea. It's not a good idea to have lawyers involved in these things, but to have such a commission investigating the hydra-headed nature, the problem of this hydra-headed nature and complexity, a problem that is rooted in our, at least recent history of democracy in the Fourth Republic, rooted in the increasingly scorched earth competition between the MPP and the NDC as the 2 main political forces of the land. A phenomenon that is getting uglier by the day and likely to get uglier. Something that evolves and speaks to the political economy of Ghana, the political culture we have evolved, very terrible political culture we've been involved in. I think that it's important that this commission includes somebody with expertise in security sector matters, at the very least, and if possible, the social or political scientists with grounding, whose research and output are grounded in the politics of Ghana, the political economy of Ghana, and the political culture of Ghana.
Prof, let me ask you about the security expert recommendation that you're making. I know that one of the members of the commission is a former IGP. Would that be sufficient?
Yeah, it's great, but not sufficient in the sense that you also want independent expertise. And maybe the commission can co-opt such a member, or they can invite those that they may identify, to some that they may identify to appear before it and to share their expertise and their insights on these matters. But I think, you know, if you think of what it would take for the Commission to elaborate its terms of reference so that it captures the full spirit of what we have been experiencing and what we are all alarmed about and what it needs to do, I'm afraid that having a commission whose membership are all lawyers, all four of them are lawyers, including the former GP, to me, comes with a danger of shifting the focus of the discussions narrowly into the legal and constitutional realms. Important as they are, but I think that we should allow other core competencies, other expertise to be present at the helm of affairs of that commission.
So, Prof, let's talk first about the composition of the commission. 4 people have been selected to do the job, all 4 of them lawyers, an IGP is in there, and of course we have a judge. What are your thoughts on the composition?
Great people, highly accomplished, respectable, credible. Nobody can doubt their competence as well as integrity, as the caliber of statesmen and women they are. But I'm afraid that it's too loaded in the direction of lawyers and legal minds. And yet, this is a hydra-headed problem, a highly complex problem, a problem that touches on the core of our political practice, the core of our political culture, and the core of our political economy, and the core especially of our security. At the very least, it should have an independent security sector specialist on it. And if possible, a social or political scientist with the appropriate specialization.
Now, I know that one of the members is a former IGP. Would that not tick the box of a security specialist?
To some extent, but of course he comes from a strict police security perspective. But as you know, security is far broader than the police side of things. And so I think even he can benefit from the presence of another member who has security experience outside of the police and outside of the state, At this stage, is it a feasible outcome for government to in any way tamper with the formation, the composition of the commission? Well, it will be, first of all, it's not too late, but even if it's too late, the commission itself should co-opt appropriate persons and expertise onto its membership or consult them closely, very closely.
Okay.
Rather than leaving it to the individuals to volunteer to go before the commission.
Now, we had a look earlier at the actual terms of reference, and you can see that they are asking for a probe into the 31st of January event. I asked earlier about the democratic or constitutional nature of national security having such a force and deploying it during an election. I asked about that, and you we're confident that the commission would perhaps touch on issues of that nature. But if they are restricted to looking at 31st of December, is there not a chance that perhaps some of these peripheral issues that are all important...
31st of January, right?
January, forgive me, yes, yeah. That's when the events occurred. Is there not a genuine concern that if they are restricted to the events of that day, they may not get the opportunity, especially since they have just 1 month, to touch on some of these broader issues of the existence of this force, whether it's constitutional, the deployment of it during an election, and all of those issues? Is it not possible that we might end up missing on some of these things?
That perhaps gets us into another area of concern for me, concern about the commission and its terms of reference. I think it's a little bit too narrow. It's a little bit too narrow, and I hope that it does not confine itself only to the sordid events of the Ayawaso Wuogon constituency by-election, because even though Ayawaso may have been among the most ugliest, the most brazen, the most sordid, we all know as Ghanaians that there have been similar incidents in previous elections, and especially previous by-elections. And so I hope that the commission would allow itself the opportunity to look at these issues far more broadly than the terms of reference given to them would seem to suggest. And I think there's probably an opportunity for them to do so. There's a window, even in the existing terms of reference, as narrow as it is, for them to broaden out. But for that to happen, I'd like to see one more modification. I'd like to recommend one more modification to the terms of reference of the commission, and that 1 month is way too little for doing a thorough job on a matter as complex and hydra-headed as this one.
To your mind, what would be a more reasonable time frame?
That's a big question. It depends on how much we agree the terms of reference should be expanded. But to my mind, you cannot do this in 1 month. It's simply too short. Maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, ideally. The reason I say 3 months is we do need the findings of the commission and what we can learn from it to inform some of the changes we have to make as we prepare for the 2020 elections.
Prof, not so long ago, during the Kruntini Akwemu lecture that you delivered, you made the very important point about how state and party really need to be separated. You gave the example of party executives sitting in on cabinet meetings, and then of course you talked about vigilante groups. These are all manifestations of the blurring of the lines. Following the events of Ayawaso West Wuogon, and I guess that's what makes it even more disturbing, because these followed those events. JoyNews uncovered a letter that had been written by one of the regional security executives, national security executives, to constituency party leaders, asking them to send 10 men each for training to provide security during elections in 2020. We verified the letter. We even posed as one of the constituency chairmen and spoke to the author of the letter, wow, who confirmed that he had indeed sent out the letter and even expanded on why this was happening and so forth.
How awful.
It is what I wanted to get your take on. I mean, this happened after Ayawaso, West Wuogon. How does this give you a certain view generally of how this government is approaching the task of separating party and state?
First, I think the problem is more generic to the politics we have evolved in the Fourth Republic, and the way we are increasingly allowing partisanship to override all considerations and everything that is at stake in our democracy, in our policy making, in our actions and inactions as a nation. I said earlier that we should all consider it a matter of deep, deep concern. We should all be distressed by the fact that Ghanaian elections are increasingly perceived as life and death matters. They are perceived as war, some sort of war by some other means, and that we should remember that elections are principally about credibility of outcomes, fairness and transparency of the process. If at any point in time when a party in government or in opposition begins to think that it has to somehow place a premium on election vigilance, on militants protecting the ballot box, and the like, we should know that we are just that's a doomsday that we are walking to. So this is all bad news. I hope it didn't happen. I hope it's not happening. And if it is happening, I hope the government of the day, the NPP government, quickly moves away from this course of action. It can bring no good to the process. It just doesn't look right.
Naturally, the opposition have taken this as an opportunity to point fingers, and they are pointing their fingers directly at the president. They are saying that these things couldn't possibly be happening without his knowledge. You have a deep understanding of democracy, and you've studied successive governments and how they operate. Taking both events, the Ayawaso West Wuogon violence and this letter calling for, party men to be trained, is it the sort of thing that could happen on the blind side of the president? How big a blind side must the president have for such a thing to happen?
I don't know, can't be drawn into it. But as I said, I hope it didn't happen. I hope it's not happening. And that if it is happening, we should immediately arrest the situation. And I do hope that this commission is part of the problem, part of the process of instituting correction and corrective measures against this sort of development. So I'd rather focus on the commission that I see as an opportunity, and hope that, and talk about ways in which it can be reconfigured and ways in which the process that the commission adopts for its work is one that will get us the best possible results.
What would be the best possible outcome to your mind?
Well, first about the process. I do hope, and I don't want to second guess the commission and its fine leadership, but I do hope that the commission would hold its hearings in public in much the same way that the Gyimah-Boadi Commission that looked into allegations of narcotic drug dealing in the security sector and among sections and among some Ghanaians was treated. I think the sunshine of transparency will do a lot of good to this commission, help dispel suspicions, and also shore up the credibility of its work. At any rate, we all, as citizens of the land, can learn something from what we hear at the proceedings.
So in terms of what happens after, because you've explained how the process can be enriched, in terms of what happens after, our country doesn't really have a great record of concrete steps being taken following the work of any commission, and we can name any of them. If you ask yourself what came out of it, you might find yourself wanting. Does that fill you with any confidence that this will be anything more than some whitewashed by white paper process?
Well, we wait to see. But what I can say for now is that I would much prefer that this commission, after it's concluded its work, shares its findings and recommendations with the public, in addition to sharing it with the government. The last thing I'd like to see is for this commission to go back to the bad habit we have adopted of spending public funds on establishing these commissions, and then these commissions and committees end up treating their reports as confidential and handing it to the authority, to the government that set them up in the first place. I hope this commission understands that it is a public commission, and that in the letter and spirit of things, its duty is to the public of Ghana principally, and not to the government of the day. Because what happens when they take the latter position, that they've been assigned by the president, they are going to share the report and recommendations with the government. One, it may take too long and maybe too late when the contents of their report and findings and their recommendations are known to the rest of the public. Second, and even more commonly, if they want to inoculate the report from being doctored and selectively reported on by the government, it's in the interest of their own credibility to share it with the public. At any rate, the Gyimah-Boadi Commission report and recommendations were shared with the public at the same time as they presented it to the president. And that commission also investigated matters that were sensitive and involved all kinds of politically exposed people. So the least I would expect of this commission is to go the Gyimah-Boadi way.
Prof, so would, to your mind as an analyst of such events, would it suggest to you, if this commission decides to submit their report confidentially to government, would it suggest to you that there is something afoot?
Yes. I will just assume that the whole effort has been wasted. Because otherwise, how are we going to know what the difference between what the commission found and what recommendations it made versus what the government tells us? You know, it's a country that is still struggling after 25 years or so to get a credible right to information legislation. There's nothing in our history that will make me comfortable with a situation like that.
Another of the criticisms leveled against the commission is this suggestion that once they are in place, it then either limits or removes the capability of other institutions to look into the same matter, from police to parliament. Their hands are in some way tied by the presence of this commission.
I think that's normally an excuse for inaction. I don't see any reason why Parliament cannot initiate its own investigations on bipartisan basis or on a parliamentary committee basis. I don't see why it should be stopped from doing that. I don't see why the police cannot conduct its own investigations, come up with its own evidence for taking consequential actions against those that they may need to take actions against. I think it's normally an excuse for inaction, and there's no justification that I can see.
The police are seen in this matter for a number of reasons as not only failing to react, but being part of the problem on the day. The videos show the police were present while gunshots were ringing out, while a member of parliament was being beaten. The videos show this. The police then came out on the same day to say they didn't know who these armed men were, in spite of the fact that they turned up in police vehicles. Without seeking to overstep our bounds and wade into the work of the commission, just on the evidence of what you saw in these videos, what's your take on how the police is performing in this democracy of ours?
Mind you, I haven't seen as many videos as you seem to have seen. So.
Okay.
But if I heard this being said on the street, nothing about that will surprise me. It won't be the first time that the police and official security agencies have stood and watched citizens being maimed and injured and pelted with and shot at without action. And so that in itself wouldn't surprise me. I think what we should look into is what is it that disables the police from acting and the security agencies from acting professionally in situations like that. What is it that disables them so much that they look askance as such terrible things are going on? That's what we should look at. We should look into what is it that has made the police and the security sector in general so politicized, so over-politicized that political considerations seem to drive appointments, seem to drive actions and inactions. But again, these are some of the things that the fine brains that have been put together at the commission, I hope we'll look into.
You think they can stretch that far? Look at the,
if they don't,
setup of...
Well, if they don't, I think the exercise would have been wasteful. If they don't. But I do think that I can see how you can take on a matter like this without looking into larger causes, broader causes. You look at, I'm almost convinced that they would have no choice other than to look at both the immediate issues at stake and also the remote causes, the immediate causes and the remote causes of what we saw in Ayawaso, West Wuogon.
Do you think this commission, forgive me, is strong, resilient enough to withstand any potential political pressures that could be brought to bear on them by some individuals or even by the
I will give them
government?
I am more than willing to give this commission the benefit of the doubt, knowing the quality and the caliber of people on it.
Professor Gyimah-Boadi, thank you so much for your time with us.
Most welcome. Anytime. So,